It was late October when I signed up for a solo shift as a park ranger, patrolling the trails after dark. The deep woods were always eerie at night, but there was something about the fall air that made the trees seem closer, the shadows thicker. I had patrolled the park dozens of times before, but something about that night felt different. My flashlight was weak, its beam barely cutting through the mist that had settled over the forest. The towering pines creaked in the wind as I made my way down one of the less traveled paths. I had heard stories over the years, rumors about strange things happening deep in these woods. Most of the time, it was just old campers telling ghost stories around a fire. I never believed them until that night. As I moved deeper into the woods, I came across an old campsite. The fire pit was cold, and the tent looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. There were no signs of wildlife, no rustling of leaves or chirping of insects. The stillness was unnerving. I radioed in to let the others know I had found the site, but there was no response, just static. My heart began to race. I should have turned back, but something compelled me to go further. A thick fog had started to roll in, making it even harder to see. The path twisted and narrowed, and soon I found myself in an area of the park I had never seen before. I didn't recognize any of the landmarks. I checked my map and compass, but neither seemed to make sense. The compass needle spun wildly, as if it were confused, and the map didn't match my surroundings. Panic started to creep in. I wasn't lost, I couldn't be. Suddenly, I heard a sound. It wasn't the wind or the creaking of trees, it was something else. A low, guttural moan echoed through the woods, followed by the snap of a branch. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving between the trees. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was tall to tall. My instinct was to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood frozen, staring into the darkness, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. The sound came again, closer this time. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my breath shallow. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The forest was silent once more. I forced myself to move, slowly backing away from the direction of the sound. I had to get back to the main trail, back to the ranger station. But no matter which way I turned, the trees seemed to close in on me, blocking my way. As I stumbled through the fog, I saw something ahead, two glowing orbs floating in the distance. My heart leapt into my throat. They were eyes, reflecting in the beam of my flashlight. They were watching me. I pointed the light straight at them, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of something large and gaunt, standing just beyond the fog. It looked human, but its limbs were elongated, and its skin was pale as moonlight. It didn't move, just stood there, staring. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was away from that thing. My legs burned as I sprinted through the trees, branches slashing at my face and arms. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush, moving faster than any human could. I didn't dare look back. After what felt like an eternity, I burst into a clearing. My chest heaved, and my body ached, but I didn't stop. I ran until I saw the faint glow of the ranger station's lights in the distance. I threw myself through the door and locked it behind me. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next morning, I returned to the area with another ranger. The fog had lifted, and the woods looked normal, peaceful even. But when we reached the clearing where I had first seen the creature, we found something strange. There, in the soft earth, were footprints, giant human-like prints, much larger than any person's. They led deep into the woods and disappeared into the darkness. We never spoke about it again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there had let me go. It had been watching, waiting, and it knew I would come back. It was my first week as a park ranger in a remote wilderness area, and I was eager to immerse myself in nature. The days were spent patrolling trails and checking on campsites, but the nights were different. The vastness of the woods felt both comforting and isolating. One late October evening, with the sun setting earlier and shadows growing longer, I received a call from a family camping deep in the forest. They reported hearing strange noises outside their tent. The father sounded frantic, claiming it sounded like something was circling their campsite. I quickly gathered my gear and set off down the path. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched under my boots, a stark contrast to the unease building in my stomach. As I hiked, the trees loomed overhead, their gnarled branches clawing at the darkening sky. I pushed the thoughts of what might be lurking in the shadows from my mind. I had a job to do. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the family's campsite. The tent was zipped tightly, and the campfire was reduced to glowing embers. I called out to them, my voice echoing through the trees, but there was no answer. A chill ran down my spine as I unzipped the tent and peered inside. The sleeping bags were undisturbed, but the family was gone. Just then, I heard a rustling nearby. My heart raced as I turned toward the sound. I swept my flashlight over the trees and spotted movement. A figure, tall and thin, was crouched down, just beyond the light's reach. Its back was turned to me, but I could see the outline of long limbs and something glimmering in its hands. I called out again, this time my voice shaking with a mix of fear and adrenaline. The figure slowly turned its head, and I was struck by a horrifying realization. It wasn't human. Its face was a twisted caricature, elongated and with hollow eyes that seemed to swallow the light. I stumbled back, trying to suppress the urge to scream. My instincts kicked in, and I turned to run, sprinting back down the path I had just come from. Branches snapped underfoot as I fled, the sounds of the forest merging into a cacophony of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. I dared not look back. As I approached a clearing, I spotted the glimmer of my flashlight reflecting off something metallic. I skidded to a stop, and my heart dropped. It was an axe, buried in the ground near a tree stump. The sight sent a jolt of fear through me. Why was it here? Who had left it? I quickly glanced around, the growling noise from before echoing in my mind. It was getting closer. Panic surged as I turned and ran again, adrenaline pushing me forward. I finally burst out of the woods and onto the main road, gasping for breath. The sound of the rustling behind me faded into the distance. I found my truck parked by the entrance and jumped in, slamming the door shut. I fumbled for the radio, ready to call for backup. But just as I began to speak, the silence was shattered by a frantic knocking on my window. I jumped, my heart racing. It was the family I had been searching for, wide-eyed and breathless. They were alive. I opened the door, letting them inside the truck. They explained that they had heard strange noises and decided to run for help. I couldn't believe they had managed to escape. We all sat in silence for a moment, trying to calm our racing hearts. I told them about the figure I had seen and the axe I found. Their faces went pale as the father whispered that they had seen it too. They described the same gaunt creature, lurking near their tent, watching them with those hollow eyes. We shared a moment of disbelief and fear, realizing we had all encountered something sinister that night. Just as we were about to leave, the family pointed toward the forest behind us. I turned slowly, my stomach dropping. In the moonlight, the same figure stood at the edge of the tree line, holding the axe. It was staring directly at us. We all froze, unable to comprehend what we were seeing. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the woods. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the next unsuspecting campers. What had started as a simple night patrol had morphed into a nightmare, leaving us with more questions than answers. The woods were full of secrets, and I realized some of them were better left undiscovered. I was fresh out of ranger training when I was assigned to one of the most remote sections of the forest. It was early fall, and the trees were ablaze with red and gold leaves. Most visitors had left for the season, which suited me just fine. I loved the quiet. The stillness of the woods gave me time to reflect, but that peace was about to be shattered. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I received a call on my radio about a family who had set up camp deep in the woods. They reported strange noises outside their tent. I had been patrolling the area, so I decided to check on them. The trail was familiar, but darkness descended quickly, and my flashlight seemed to struggle against the thickening shadows. As I approached their campsite, I heard a low, unsettling growl echoing through the trees. My heart raced. I knew bears were common in these woods, but this was different. The growl had an unnatural quality, a resonance that felt almost human. I quickened my pace, muscles tense, flashlight flickering against the growing darkness. When I reached their campsite, the family's tent was pitched but empty. The fire was still smoldering, and scattered belongings lay haphazardly around. I called out, my voice shaking, but only silence answered. I stepped into the tent, and everything looked normal at first. But then I noticed something odd. Deep claw marks scored the ground outside the entrance, as if something had been pacing there. Anxious and agitated, I felt a chill run down my spine. I took a step back, scanning the area for any sign of the family. That's when I heard the growl again, now louder and closer. I whipped around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I caught a glimpse of something shifting in the shadows, tall, thin, and impossibly elongated. It had a human shape, but was far too lanky to be anything recognizable. I felt an instinctual urge to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground. I managed to force my legs into motion and bolted back toward the trail. Behind me, the creature let out a piercing scream that echoed through the trees, sending a shockwave of terror through me. I didn't look back. I raced down the path, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear it following me, fast and silent, like the wind itself. Just as I reached a clearing, I tripped over a tree root and fell hard to the ground. My flashlight rolled away, extinguishing itself in the dirt. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to my feet, barely registering the sounds of the forest around me. The growling had stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence that engulfed the clearing. I stumbled toward my flashlight, breathless and terrified. As I grabbed it and turned it back on, I aimed the beam into the trees. My stomach dropped as I saw the creature standing at the edge of the woods, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. It wasn't advancing. It just stood there, watching me. Then, without warning, the creature turned and dashed into the darkness, moving faster than I could comprehend. Confusion flooded my mind. What was it doing? I took a step back, heart still racing, when suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. "Ranger, over here." I spun around to see a group of campers emerging from the brush. Their faces were pale, and I could see the fear in their eyes. They told me they had witnessed the creature too, that they had been camping nearby and had fled when they saw it approach their tent. They confirmed that the family was safe, just a short distance away. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I tried to explain what had happened, the growl and the chase, but their eyes widened in horror as they listened. I could sense their disbelief and fear, but the fact remained that we all survived the night. Later, when I returned to the ranger station, I filed my report and shared the details with my supervisor. He listened intently, then leaned in closer. "Did you get a good look at it?" he asked. I nodded, still shaken. He sighed, a knowing look on his face. "Rangers in this area have seen it before. We call it the Watcher. No one knows what it is or where it comes from. Just be glad it didn't decide to come closer." A chill settled deep in my bones as I realized that what I had seen might not have been a random encounter, but part of a much darker reality, hidden in the woods. The forest had its secrets, and I was just beginning to scratch the surface. As a park ranger, I was accustomed to the tranquility of the woods. My shifts usually involved checking on campers, patrolling trails, and ensuring everything was in order. However, that one evening in late October, everything changed. It started innocently enough. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. I was making my rounds when I noticed a flickering light deep in the woods. At first, I assumed it was just a camper's fire, but something about it felt wrong. The light was too erratic, almost frantic. Curiosity piqued. I decided to investigate. The trail quickly disappeared, swallowed by dense foliage and thick underbrush. The deeper I ventured, the more the atmosphere changed. The chirping of crickets faded, replaced by an unsettling silence that wrapped around me like a heavy fog. My flashlight beam danced nervously among the trees, revealing nothing but shadows. I was alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Finally, I reached a small clearing. In the center, I found a small campfire, its flames sputtering and nearly extinguished. But there were no signs of any campers, no tents, no gear, nothing. The air grew colder, and my instinct screamed at me to leave. Just as I turned to go, I heard a low, deep growl emanating from the darkness beyond the clearing. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The growl came again, closer this time. I aimed my flashlight toward the sound, illuminating the trees around me. That's when I saw a figure lurking just beyond the reach of my light. It was massive, a hulking shadow with glistening eyes, that reflected the light like a predator sizing up its prey. I stumbled back, adrenaline surging through my veins. I wanted to run, but fear rooted me in place. The creature stepped forward, its form becoming clearer. It had a grotesque humanoid shape, but its limbs were elongated and twisted. Just as I opened my mouth to scream, a branch snapped behind me. I turned, instinctively shining my flashlight in that direction. To my utter disbelief, I saw a camper standing there, eyes wide with terror. It was a young man, trembling as he pointed into the woods. "We have to go. It's coming." Before I could respond, the creature lunged forward, its growl echoing through the trees. We sprinted back the way I had come, the sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls chasing us. The woods transformed into a labyrinth of shadows as I navigated through the underbrush, trying to keep my bearings. We finally emerged onto the main trail, gasping for breath. I turned to the young man, who looked as pale as a ghost. "What was that thing?" I asked. He shook his head, his voice trembling. "I don't know. We were camping, and then we heard it. It just appeared out of nowhere." As we stood there, trying to catch our breath, the air around us grew cold again. I glanced back into the woods, my flashlight illuminating the darkness. I half expected the creature to charge at us again, but the forest was eerily quiet. The young man and I decided to hike back to the ranger station together. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the creature lurking just behind the trees. But we made it back without incident. The next morning, I reported the encounter to my supervisor. We organized a search for the creature, but found nothing. The campers who had been in the area were nowhere to be found either. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Months later, as I was going through old reports, I stumbled across a case from a decade prior. A family had gone missing in the very same woods, the last sighting being a flickering light deep in the forest. My blood ran cold as I read about the circumstances surrounding their disappearance. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of that creature haunted my thoughts. The next day, I decided to return to the clearing, hoping to find some trace of the campers. As I approached the spot, I saw something glinting in the dirt. It was a broken watch, one that looked eerily familiar. I picked it up, my breath hitching as I read the inscription. It was the same watch the young man had worn. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I turned, and in that moment, I realized the truth. The woods were not just watching, they were waiting for someone to join them. I had always loved the deep woods. As a park ranger, I spent my days exploring trails and checking on campers. That summer had been particularly quiet. Most families had left for the season, and I found myself patrolling areas that were usually bustling with life. The trees stood like silent sentinels, and the sounds of the forest seemed amplified in the stillness. One late afternoon, I received a call on the radio from a family camping deep in the woods. They reported strange noises outside their tent. At first, I brushed it off as wildlife, perhaps a deer or a raccoon, but the father's voice trembled with fear as he described the sounds. It was terrific, he insisted, not like anything they had heard before. Something in his tone sent a chill down my spine. I grabbed my gear and made my way to their campsite, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. The sun dipped below the horizon, and shadows stretched long and thin across the ground. As I walked, the familiar path became less inviting, the air heavy with an unshakable sense of dread. I reached the campsite as darkness fell, and the only light came from the flickering glow of their campfire. The family, a mother, father, and 2 children, sat huddled together, their faces pale. They explained that the noises had started as low growls, but soon morphed into something more unsettling and eerie chanting that seemed to echo through the trees. I scanned the area, feeling the weight of their fear settling in my chest. The father pointed toward the woods, his finger trembling. It was then that I heard a distant, rhythmic sound that pierced through the silence. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. The chant was muffled, yet it resonated with an unnatural quality that made my skin crawl. I felt a chill wind swirl around us, sending leaves swirling in chaotic patterns. I told the family to stay by the fire, and I stepped away, shining my flashlight into the darkened woods. The beam danced nervously over the trees, illuminating nothing but the bark and shadows. The chanting seemed to grow louder, creeping closer. I retraced my steps back to the family, but just as I turned, I noticed something moving in the darkness. A tall figure slipped between the trees, its form almost blending into the night. I swallowed hard, convinced my imagination was playing tricks on me. It wasn't unusual for rangers to feel unnerved at night, but I felt compelled to investigate. I told the family to stay put and quietly approached the edge of the forest. The chanting stopped, replaced by unsettling silence that pressed down on me like a weight dot as I stepped deeper into the trees. The atmosphere shifted. The air turned cold, and the familiar sounds of the woods faded away. I could hear only my heartbeat echoing in my ears, pounding louder as I ventured further into the unknown. I trained my flashlight on the path ahead, but the beam flickered ominously, threatening to go out completely. Suddenly, the chanting erupted again, louder and more urgent. I could feel it reverberate through my bones. It seemed to come from all around me, as if the trees themselves were alive and whispering secrets. Panic surged within me, but I pushed forward, determined to uncover the source. Then I saw a circle of strange symbols etched into the ground, surrounded by twisted branches that formed a crude barrier. The figure I had seen earlier stood at the center, but it was not human. It was tall and thin, with elongated limbs and glowing eyes that reflected my flashlight like mirrors. My breath caught in my throat as it turned toward me, its face a void, a black pit that seemed to swallow the light. I stumbled back, heart racing, but the family was just behind me, having followed out of concern. I turned to them, shouting for them to run, but before I could react, the figure lunged. I stumbled backward, expecting the worst, but instead, the ground erupted in a flash of light. The symbols glowed bright, illuminating the woods for a brief moment before plunging everything back into darkness. The creature vanished, leaving only a lingering echo of its chant behind. The family looked at me, their faces a mix of fear and confusion. I led them back to the campsite, my heart still pounding. The strange occurrences continued through the night, but we remained together, the family's presence grounding me. In the morning, we reported everything to the authorities, but when the search teams returned to the site, they found nothing, no symbols, no signs of the creature. The family and I were left with our memories, the knowledge of what we had experienced buried within us. As the family packed up to leave, I realized something chilling. The chanting had stopped, but the echo of those glowing eyes lingered in my mind, a haunting reminder that sometimes the woods hold secrets best left undiscovered. I had been a park ranger for several years, but nothing prepared me for that night. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched beneath my boots as I patrolled the remote campground. It was late October, and most campers had left. I enjoyed the solitude of the deep woods, the silence that only nature could provide. But on that night, an unsettling feeling crept over me, like fingers of cold dread wrapping around my spine. As I checked the campsites, my radio crackled to life. The voice of another ranger broke through the static. He reported a family that had set up camp late in the day. They planned to stay overnight but had not checked in. This wasn't unusual, but my instincts told me something was off. I decided to investigate, walking deeper into the woods. I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. My flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the tall trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. As I approached the family's campsite, I noticed an odd stillness in the air. The chirping of crickets had ceased, leaving only an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. When I reached the clearing, I found the tent still standing, but there was no sign of the family. I called out to them, but my voice echoed back with no response. Cautiously, I unzipped the tent flap, peering inside. Their belongings were scattered about: sleeping bags, cooking gear, but no people. Panic gnawed at my stomach. Suddenly, I heard rustling nearby. My heart raced as I swung the flashlight toward the sound, illuminating a small animal scurrying into the underbrush. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, but then I heard a low growl coming from the tree line. The sound was unlike anything I had ever encountered, a guttural noise that sent shivers down my spine. I stepped back, trying to rationalize it. It could be a bear, I thought, but deep down, I knew this was different. The growl was closer now, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had to get back to the ranger station and call for help, but as I turned to leave, a sharp rustle came from behind me, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the bushes. I bolted toward the path, adrenaline pumping through my veins. My flashlight beam flickered erratically as I sprinted, the shadows seeming to twist and stretch around me. I dared a glance back, but nothing was there. I stumbled, nearly losing my footing, but I pressed on, pushing through the underbrush. As I reached the main trail, I heard laughter, a child's laughter echoing from the campsite. Confused, I stopped in my tracks. The family must have returned, I thought. I called out, relief flooding through me. I turned back toward the clearing, but there was only darkness. The laughter faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Just then, a voice broke the stillness, a chilling whisper that seemed to come from all directions. Help us! I froze, the blood draining from my face. It sounded like the family. I raced back to the campsite, my heart pounding in my chest. When I arrived, the tent was still empty. I called out again, desperation creeping into my voice. Where are you? My flashlight beam flickered wildly as I scanned the area. That's when I saw them figures standing just beyond the tree line. They looked like the family, but they were all turned away from me, their backs facing the campsite. Are you okay? I shouted, my voice trembling. They didn't respond, just stood there motionless. I stepped closer, dread pulling in my stomach. And that's when I realized they weren't moving at all. Their clothes were tattered, and their hair hung in wild tangles. The moonlight illuminated their forms, and my breath caught in my throat. With a sudden rush of fear, I turned and ran back toward my truck. I could feel something hot on my heels, a presence that I dared not look back at. I jumped into the vehicle, slamming the door and locking it tight. My hands shook as I started the engine, and as I sped away, I caught a glimpse of the figures in my rearview mirror, standing silently, watching. Later, I reported the missing family. Search teams combed the area for days, but found no trace of them. The park closed for the season, and the other rangers reassured me that it was likely to be just a case of people getting lost, but I knew what I saw. I often wonder if they are still out there, trapped in the woods, forever whispering for help, their laughter fading into the night, their figures watching from the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too far into the dark. I had always loved the solitude of the woods. As a park ranger, my job was to protect these natural wonders, but I also enjoyed the peace that came with the deep trees and endless trails. However, my perspective shifted during a chilling autumn night that I still can't shake. It was late October when the leaves transformed into brilliant reds and golds, drawing visitors to the park for one last glimpse before winter. I was scheduled for a night shift, checking the campsites and ensuring everyone was safe. The chill in the air hinted at an approaching storm, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I made my rounds. The campgrounds were mostly empty. The few campers that remained were huddled around their fires, sharing ghost stories. I smiled at their laughter, but it faded quickly as I walked deeper into the woods. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, and a sense of unease began creeping in. About an hour into my shift, I heard rustling in the bushes nearby. I paused, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was unnerving, almost deliberate. I shone my flashlight toward the noise, but only darkness greeted me. I hesitated, but the sound stopped, and I dismissed it as a deer or some other animal. I continued my patrol, but that feeling of being watched lingered. When I reached the farthest campsite, I noticed a flickering light. I approached cautiously, thinking it might be an unattended fire. Instead, I found a tent with the flap wide open and no one around. Inside, there were scattered belongings and a half-eaten sandwich lying on the ground, as if someone had left in a hurry. My instincts kicked in. Something felt very wrong. I called out for the campers, but there was no response, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I decided to check the nearby trails, but as I walked away from the campsite, I heard it again, a low, guttural growl echoing through the trees. It sent chills down my spine, but I pressed on, trying to rationalize it as my imagination. The forest seemed to darken as the wind picked up, carrying a sudden coldness that wrapped around me. I hurried back to the campsite, but the tent was still empty. Panic began to set in as I fumbled for my radio to call for backup, but the device crackled with static. I was alone. I decided to head back to the main road, thinking I could catch a passing ranger or even a hiker. But the deeper I walked, the more disoriented I felt. The trees loomed overhead, blocking out any trace of moonlight, and I realized I had lost my way. The growl returned, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of something heavy moving through the brush. My heart raced as I turned to run, but then I saw a figure standing in the shadows, partially obscured by the trees. It was tall and emaciated, with elongated limbs and eyes that glowed like cold embers in the dark. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. My instincts kicked in, and I took off in the opposite direction, adrenaline coursing through me. As I ran, branches snagged at my clothes, and the underbrush crunched beneath my feet. The growling intensified behind me, chasing me through the maze of trees. Just when I thought I was safe, I tripped over a root and fell. The wind knocked out of me. I scrambled to my feet and glanced back. The figure had stopped, but I could feel its gaze boring into my back. Desperate, I sprinted toward a clearing, praying it would lead me to safety. Bursting into the open, I spotted the campers I had seen earlier. They were standing by their fire, but something was off. Their faces were blank, eyes wide and unblinking. They stared past me into the darkness of the woods. I called out to them, but they didn't respond. I turned to see the figure emerge from the trees, and the campers began to scream. I felt a wave of terror wash over me as I realized the campers weren't frozen in fear. They were entranced, caught in some horrifying spell. In that moment, the figure lunged at them, but just before it could reach them, it vanished into thin air. The campers blinked and suddenly returned to normal, confusion etched on their faces. I didn't know if I was dreaming or if I had lost my mind, but the figure was gone, leaving only an echo of its growl behind. The campers recounted their own experiences of feeling watched, of shadows moving just out of sight. We all made it back to the ranger station that night, shaken but alive, leaving the mystery of the woods behind us. Yet sometimes, as I patrol the park, I catch glimpses of glowing eyes watching from the trees, and I can't shake the feeling that something is still out there, waiting. I had been a park ranger for just over a year, and it was a crisp October evening when I found myself on night patrol. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind whispered through the trees. The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow that illuminated the path ahead. I loved this time of year. The air was cool, and the vibrant autumn colors made the woods feel alive. As I rounded a bend, my radio crackled to life. I heard the anxious voice of another ranger. He reported that a group of campers hadn't returned from their hike and were overdue. Concern flooded me as I noted the time. It was getting late, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. I assured him I would head out to look for them. With my flashlight in hand, I set off down the trail. The deeper I ventured into the woods, the more the world around me faded into shadows. I called out to the campers as I walked, hoping to hear a response, but the only reply was the haunting echo of my own voice. Suddenly, I heard something in the distance: laughter. It sounded like it was coming from deeper in the forest. I quickened my pace, the sound of laughter growing louder as I moved closer. As I approached, I noticed something odd. The laughter had taken on an unsettling tone, almost mocking. I broke through the underbrush and stumbled into a clearing. My flashlight beam flickered over several tents set up in a semicircle, but the laughter had ceased. The clearing was empty, and the campers were nowhere to be seen. A chill crept up my spine. It felt as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I decided to check the tents. As I unzipped the flap of the first tent, my heart raced. Inside, it was just a mess of sleeping bags and camping gear. No sign of struggle, no indication anyone had been here recently. I moved to the next tent, and when I unzipped it, I was hit by a strange smell, something sweet and putrid. I froze. There was something off about the air. I looked around, feeling a deep sense of unease settle in. I scanned the clearing, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. The trees loomed tall and dark, and I could hear the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. That's when I noticed a dark figure standing at the edge of the woods, partially hidden behind a tree. My pulse quickened, and I gripped my flashlight tighter. I called out, demanding to know who was there. The figure didn't move. I took a hesitant step closer, shining my light toward the figure. As I did, it stepped out from behind the tree, revealing itself. It was a person, but something was horribly wrong. Their limbs were contorted, and their eyes were wide and unblinking. A chill shot through me. This was not a camper. Just then, The laughter erupted again, this time much closer, echoing through the trees. It was a chorus of voices, high-pitched and mocking, like children playing a twisted game. I felt my heart race as the figure began to move toward me, its body swaying unnaturally. I stumbled back, my instincts screaming at me to run. As I turned to flee, I tripped over a root and fell hard to the ground. I scrambled to my feet and bolted back toward the trail, the laughter ringing in my ears. I could hear footsteps behind me, quick and light, as if they were chasing me. I burst out of the woods and onto the main path, gasping for breath. I ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back until I reached the ranger station. When I finally made it, I slammed the door behind me, locking it tight. I collapsed against the wall, trying to steady my racing heart. My radio crackled again, pulling me from my panic. The other ranger's voice cut through, frantic and desperate. He had found the campers huddled together in their tents, but they were terrified and refusing to come out. They had heard the laughter too, but it had stopped as soon as they entered the tents. I felt a chill wash over me. As I relayed what I had seen, I looked out the window into the dark woods. The laughter started again, echoing from the trees, and I realized with horror that the campers had been lured away. Whatever had been in the woods wasn't finished with us yet. The mocking laughter filled the air, and I knew deep down that the forest was hiding more than just shadows. It was alive, and it would not let us go easily. It was late October when I got called for an evening patrol deep in the woods. I had been a park ranger for a few years, but I had never seen the woods this empty. The leaves had turned vibrant shades of orange and red, but a chill in the air warned me that winter was creeping in. My radio crackled with static as I drove deeper into the forest. I flipped on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the dense trees. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods transformed into an eerie labyrinth of shadows. I stopped at a clearing where a family had set up camp. They were enjoying a quiet night by the fire, laughter echoing in the silence. I waved and continued on my patrol, reminding myself to check back later. The forest felt alive. The rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, and the distant hoot of an owl all combined to create an unsettling symphony. As night fell, the family's laughter faded into the distance, replaced by a profound silence. I made my way to the nearby trails, feeling the hairs on my neck prickle. It was then that I heard something, a low, guttural growl. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the direction of the family's campsite. I radioed dispatch, but received no response. Anxiety coursed through me as I made my way back to the clearing. The fire was now just glowing embers, the tent sagging and unlit. I called out, hoping for a reply. Silence. Then I saw a dark figure, lurking just beyond the tree line. My flashlight flickered, illuminating the creature for a split second. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, and its eyes glowed like embers. I stepped back, my mind racing. It couldn't be real. I had to get to the family. As I ran, the air grew colder. I stumbled into the campsite, breathless and panicked. The tent was empty, and their belongings lay scattered. I yelled for them again, the sound echoing through the stillness. Just then, I heard a rustle behind me. I turned, flashlight raised, ready to confront whatever was there. The figure stepped into the light, but it wasn't what I expected. It was the father from the family, his eyes wide with fear. He looked disheveled, as if he had been running. He grabbed my arm, breathing heavily. "It's not safe here," he gasped. "We need to leave now." Before I could ask what happened, I heard the growl again, closer this time. The man's grip tightened. We rushed away from the campsite, stumbling through the underbrush. The darkness closed in around us, and I could feel the weight of something behind us. I led him toward the road, but just as we reached the edge of the forest, I glanced back and saw the creature. It was closer now, its twisted form illuminated by the moonlight. Panic surged through me, and I yelled for the father to hurry. We ran, pushing ourselves through the thick brush, the creature's growls echoing in the night. Just when I thought we would be overtaken, we burst out onto the road. The safety of the streetlights was a relief, but I dared not look back. We collapsed on the pavement, gasping for breath. I turned to the father, ready to ask what he had seen. His face was pale, eyes wide with disbelief. "We thought it was just a bear," he stammered. "But it wasn't. It was something else." As we sat there, catching our breath, I noticed the lights of my truck in the distance. Relief washed over me, but as I stood to head toward it, I glanced back one last time. The figure stood at the edge of the woods, watching us. It tilted its head, and in that moment, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Where its mouth should have been was an empty, gaping hole, just a dark void. In that instant, everything shifted. I turned to the father, ready to shout a warning, but before I could speak, he collapsed. I rushed to him, panic setting in. He was gone, lifeless, but the terror wasn't over. As I looked back toward the woods, the figure was now gone, just darkness. The weight of dread settled in my stomach, and I realized the truth. It hadn't been just a creature, it had been feeding on fear. I got up, my heart racing. I sprinted toward my truck, knowing the woods held more secrets than I had ever imagined. Whatever had taken that family was still out there, waiting for its next victim. I always thought being a park ranger would be a peaceful job. I spent my days hiking the trails, keeping an eye on the wildlife, and sharing my love for the outdoors with visitors. But that all changed one fateful autumn night. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I wrapped up my last patrol and headed back to the ranger station. The woods took on a different feel after dark, and even though I was alone, I felt a strange sense of unease. I locked up the station and decided to take a short walk before heading home. There was something about the silence that drew me in. I wandered deeper into the woods, the flashlight beam dancing between the trees. The familiar paths felt different in the dark, and every crack of a twig made my heart race. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise, a low, grating sound. It seemed to come from somewhere nearby. I stopped, holding my breath, and listened. It was unlike anything I had ever encountered in the forest. It sounded almost like someone whispering, but there was a raspy edge to it. I shivered, dismissing it as my imagination running wild. Continuing my walk, I stumbled upon an old camping site. The fire pit was cold, the logs arranged haphazardly. I remembered this spot. It was a popular camping area for families. I pulled out my radio, ready to check in with the other rangers, when I noticed something strange. There were two sets of footprints leading away from the site, but they were mixed with something else, something that looked like claw marks. My heart began to pound as I knelt to inspect them. The prints were large, almost too big to belong to any animal in the area. I tried to rationalize it, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light. But the feeling of being watched crept back in. I stood up, suddenly feeling exposed. That's when I heard it again, the grating whispering. It was closer this time. I swung my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. I stepped back, feeling a chill run down my spine. The whispers intensified, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run. I turned and sprinted back toward the path, the light bouncing erratically in front of me. Just as I rounded a corner, my foot caught on a root, and I stumbled forward, crashing to the ground. The flashlight flew from my hand, extinguishing the only source of light. Panic surged through me as I fumbled to turn it back on. In the darkness, the whispers became louder, almost mocking. I finally managed to get it working again and aimed the beam into the trees. I was greeted by a horrifying sight. Standing just outside the circle of light was a figure, tall and thin, with long, gangly limbs. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette against the backdrop of the trees. My breath caught in my throat. I bolted to my feet and ran. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, echoing all around me. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I raced down the path. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it and leaned against it, panting heavily. After a few moments, I forced myself to calm down. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. I was just tired from my long day. I flipped the light on and checked my radio. Just as I was about to call it a night, a chilling sound broke through the silence. A soft knock echoed from the door. My heart raced as I approached, hesitantly peering through the window. Outside stood a family, mom, dad, and two kids, looking lost and frightened. They explained they had been camping nearby when they heard strange sounds and saw a figure in the woods. They had fled, thinking they would find help. My body relaxed, relieved that I wasn't alone in this. I welcomed them in and made them comfortable while I called for assistance. They described the whispers and the figure, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. As I turned to grab some extra blankets, I glanced back at the window, and that's when I saw it again. The tall, thin figure was standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. But this time, it wasn't alone. The trees were alive with movement, and all around the figure were dozens of those same twisted silhouettes, all staring in silence. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I wasn't crazy. The whispers hadn't been in my head. The forest had been hiding something much darker all along. The family beside me had unwittingly stumbled into something I had barely escaped, and now it felt like it was closing in. It was late October when I took my last shift as a park ranger before winter. The air was sharp and cold, and the leaves crunched underfoot as I made my rounds through the dense woods. This area was usually filled with hikers and families, but as the temperature dropped, the trails were empty. I found solace in the quiet, a kind of peace that allowed me to lose myself in the sounds of nature. As dusk approached, I made my way to the campground, where a few brave souls had set up for the night. I greeted them, checking that their fires were safe and their tents were secure. I reassured them about the wildlife, reminding them to store food properly. It was routine work, but the excitement of being in the woods kept me alert. Around 8 p.m., I began my final patrol of the night. The darkness settled in quickly, swallowing the path ahead. My flashlight beam danced erratically, revealing twisted branches and shadows that played tricks on my mind. The air grew heavy, and an unsettling sensation crept over me. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. As I turned a corner, I heard something, a soft rustling that didn't belong to the wind. My heart raced, and I trained my flashlight toward the sound. A few yards away, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as I focused, I realized it was too large and too human-like. It stood partially obscured by the trees, a tall figure hunched over. I called out, trying to sound confident, but my voice faltered. The figure froze, its head snapping up to reveal a face obscured by shadows. I squinted, trying to make out its features, but the light didn't reach far enough. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Instinct kicked in, and I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned, deciding to head back to the campground. As I walked, the rustling began again, but this time it was closer. I felt a jolt of panic. The sound grew into a quick succession of footfalls, echoing my movements. Whatever it was following me. I sprinted toward the main path, adrenaline surging through my veins. The flashlight flickered as I ran, casting erratic shadows on the trees. I heard a growl, low and guttural, reverberating through the air. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The pounding of my heart drowned out everything else as I rushed toward the campsite. I burst into the clearing, nearly stumbling into the fire pit where a few campers were sitting around the flames. They looked up, startled, as I gasped for breath. I quickly explained what I had seen, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. The campers were nervous, but intrigued, asking questions that I couldn't answer. Suddenly, one of the campers pointed behind me. Eyes wide, I turned, flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure stood at the edge of the trees, illuminated by the firelight. It was taller than any person I had ever seen, its limbs impossibly long. My breath caught in my throat as I caught a glimpse of its face. It was gaunt, hollow, with eyes that glowed unnaturally bright. I felt a rush of dread, but before I could react, the creature lunged forward, vanishing into the darkness. The campers screamed and scrambled to gather their things. We needed to get out of there, and fast. We ran together, the sound of our footsteps drowning out the panic. Just as we reached the main road, I glanced back, and for a split second, I thought I saw the creature standing among the trees, watching us go. We reached the parking lot, breathless and shaken. I radioed for backup, my hands trembling as I relayed the incident. As the sun began to rise, we waited anxiously for help to arrive. Eventually, two other rangers pulled up, but when they searched the area, they found nothing. No tracks, no sign of disturbance. It was as if the woods had swallowed the creature whole. That morning, as the campers and I shared our experience, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. We were all alive, yet something felt off. As they prepared to leave, one of the campers handed me a small piece of fabric. It was torn and dirty, yet familiar. I turned it over, and a chill ran down my spine. It was part of my uniform, the same fabric I had lost weeks before during a routine patrol. I had never been out there alone. I had never seen the creature before, yet here I stood, holding evidence of a connection I couldn't explain. The woods had secrets, and some stories were meant to remain untold. It was a late autumn evening when I began my shift as a park ranger. The air was crisp, and the last vestiges of daylight seeped through the dense canopy of trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor. I loved this time of year. The vibrant colors, the quiet that enveloped the woods as most campers had already packed up for the season. I took my first stroll down the main trail, making sure everything was in order. About an hour into my rounds, I received a radio call from a family camping near the far end of the park. They reported odd noises outside their tent, sounds that didn't match the usual wildlife. I assured them I would head over immediately. Their campsite was a good hike away, and with each step, I felt the growing tension in the air, as if the woods were holding their breath. By the time I reached their site, the sun had completely vanished. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped into the clearing. The tent was unzipped, and I called out, but no one answered. I shone my flashlight into the tent. Their belongings were scattered inside, but the family was nowhere to be found. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. That's when I heard a low growl, deep and guttural, reverberating through the trees. It sent a shiver racing up my spine. I turned off my flashlight, straining to hear better. The growl came again, louder, closer. It wasn't a bear. It felt almost human, twisted in some unnatural way. I backed out of the tent slowly, my heart pounding. As I stepped outside, the hairs on my neck stood on end. My flashlight flickered, and I could have sworn I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. I called out for the family, my voice shaky and barely audible. Then, just at the tree line, I saw a figure, tall and thin, partially obscured by darkness. It stood unnaturally still, its head tilted at an odd angle. I felt my pulse quicken. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but the creature took a step forward, and I could see its face, or what I thought was a face. It was pale, featureless except for deep, hollow eye sockets. My breath caught in my throat as it let out another growl, echoing through the night. I sprinted back to my vehicle, adrenaline propelling me forward. I fumbled for the radio, trying to call for backup, but the static crackled loudly, making my heart race even faster. I finally managed to get a message out, desperate for someone to respond. I jumped into the truck and locked the doors, staring out into the abyss of trees surrounding me. Moments felt like hours, and I was about to lose hope when another ranger arrived, his headlights cutting through the darkness. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as he stepped out. I quickly explained what I had seen, my words tumbling out in a rush. He listened intently, and as we prepared to search for the family, we heard something, the unmistakable sound of laughter echoing through the trees. Confused, we followed the sound. It led us deeper into the woods, where the trees were so thick I could hardly see. Then we stumbled into a small clearing. There they were, the family, huddled around a small campfire, roasting marshmallows and laughing like nothing was wrong. I felt my heart drop. I rushed toward them, demanding to know where they had been. The father looked at me with a puzzled expression. They had heard the growl, but assumed it was just a bear and decided to wait it out. I was flooded with relief, but something felt off. As we gathered around the fire, I noticed the mother was pale, her hands trembling. She glanced nervously toward the trees. I followed her gaze, and suddenly, the air grew cold. The laughter faded, replaced by a low, haunting growl. The family's faces turned to shock as the figure stepped into the light, its movement slow and deliberate, but then it stopped, hovering at the edge of the firelight. I was sure it would attack, but instead, it turned its head and looked directly at me, those hollow eye sockets boring into my soul. Just as I opened my mouth to scream, the fire flared up brightly, and in that moment, the figure simply vanished. The family stood frozen, their faces white with fear. The growl faded into silence. We all looked at one another, unsure of what had just happened. What was real? Had I imagined the creature? Or had it truly been there? The night ended with us all packed tightly together around the campfire, the eerie silence settling around us like a shroud. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that the woods are not as empty as they seem. I hear whispers in the wind and feel eyes watching me. Whatever was lurking in the shadows that night might not be gone for good. As a park ranger, I had spent countless nights patrolling the deep woods, but one October evening still stands out in my mind. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels. I was assigned the late shift, my radio crackling softly as I moved through the trails, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness. It was a typical night until I received a call from a couple camping in a secluded area about 10 miles into the woods. They reported hearing strange noises, a mix of growls and whispers that sent shivers down their spines. I tried to calm them, assuring them it was likely just a nearby animal, but their fear was palpable. I told them I would head their way and check things out. The hike to their campsite was uneventful at first, the familiar sounds of the forest filling my ears. But as I walked deeper into the woods, the atmosphere shifted. The sounds faded, and an unnatural silence enveloped me. My flashlight flickered, and I shook it, hoping to coax it back to life. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. Goosebumps prickled my skin, and I quickened my pace. When I finally reached the couple's campsite, the sight that greeted me sent a chill down my spine. Their tent stood in disarray, the zipper partially open, and belongings scattered around as if a storm had swept through. But the couple was nowhere to be found. I called out their names, but only silence answered. My instincts kicked in, and I moved cautiously, scanning the area. As I walked further into the woods, I stumbled upon a trail of what looked like deep claw marks gouged into the bark of nearby trees. My heart raced as I followed the marks, trying to piece together what had happened. Each claw mark seemed to lead deeper into the shadows, beckoning me forward. Suddenly, a branch snapped behind me, and I whirled around, my flashlight beam sweeping across the trees. I was alone, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I took a deep breath and pressed on, hoping to find the couple or at least something that would explain their disappearance. As I turned a corner, I caught a glimpse of movement. My heart raced as I followed the movement, adrenaline surging through me. I stumbled upon a small clearing where I saw a figure standing with its back to me. It was tall and thin, its form barely visible in the dim light. My instinct screamed for me to run, but curiosity held me in place. I called out softly, asking if they were okay, but the figure remained motionless. A chill ran down my spine, and I took a cautious step closer. Just as I was about to reach out, the figure turned. My stomach dropped as I caught sight of its face, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I stumbled back in shock, and the figure opened its mouth to let out a blood-curdling scream. I turned to flee, my heart pounding in my chest as I sprinted back the way I came. Behind me, the figure's scream echoed through the trees, a haunting sound that filled the air. I could hear the rustling of leaves and snapping branches as it pursued me, but I didn't dare look back. I finally burst through the tree line and into the clearing where the couple's tent still stood. Panting, I skidded to a stop, turning to face the forest. The darkness seemed to swallow everything, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The growling returned, echoing through the trees, and I prepared for whatever might come. Just then, the couple emerged from the woods, their faces pale with fear. They looked as if they had seen a ghost, and I couldn't help but feel relief wash over me. They told me they had wandered off looking for firewood and had gotten lost, but as I looked back into the forest, I noticed something chilling. The figure I had seen was standing just at the edge of the tree line, watching us with those same hollow eyes. I grabbed the couple and we hiked back to the ranger station, glancing over our shoulders, convinced that whatever had followed us was still lurking in the shadows. We made it safely back, but as I sat down at my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had let something dark escape the woods that night, a presence that was no longer confined to the deep trees.